Hey all, Armchair Prepper, Google's cat, Doris Lessing, The Memoirs of a Survivor. I love Doris Lessing, I'm totally biased, I love it. The Armchair Prepper series looks at books. Prepping angle, my prepping angle, 1974, different world back then, I was 10. This is a slow apocalypse through the eyes of a middle class, fairly comfortably well off English woman living in a suburban town, well maybe it's a city. As ever with Doris Lessing, it's an easy read, pleasant read, easy to read this stuff, deceptively so. She asks many questions and she causes many questions to be asked in your mind as the reader that she never bothers to answer. It's not laziness, it's actually her style. She wants to generate thought, not answer questions. And I think that's not a bad idea sometimes. It's hard to do. Why she is underrated, I don't know. She's had some good stuff. So it's not tidy fiction. You're not going to read this in half, a beginning, middle and an end, and then it all wraps up. It really won't. So lots of stuff here on prepping that I find interesting. One of the interesting things, I'm going to read chunks of this. One of the things we know was true for everyone, and which each of us privately thought was evidence of a stubbornly preserved originality of mind, was that we apprehended what was going on in ways that were not official, not respectable. Newscasts and newspapers and pronouncements were what we were used to, what we by no means despised. Without them we would have become despondent, anxious, for of course one must have the stamp of the official, particularly in a time when nothing is going according to expectation. But the truth of every one of us became aware at some point. It was not from official sources that we were getting the facts that were building up into a very different picture from the publicised one. Wow. Slow apocalypse. There is a gulf between why the hell do they have to be so incompetent and God things are awful, just as things are awful is a different matter again from it starting here too. Have you heard any more about it? I shall begin this account at a time before we're talking about it. We're still in the stage of generalised unease, things aren't too good. They were even pretty bad. A great many things were bad. Breaking down, giving up or giving cause for alarm, as the newscasters might put it. But it, in the sense of something felt as an immediate threat, which could be not averted, no. And that's an interesting point of view. What stage are we in? So basically, it's never identified in the book what the heck is going on. It's an ambiguous apocalypse, we don't really know why. But let's look back and let's look forward. So in the future, if there's an apocalypse, will we look back at 2017, October 2017, and say that's when it started? Or are we going to look further back and say that's when it started? In other words, or has it not actually started? Everybody will have an opinion on that, but it's kind of an interesting point. I would say we're definitely in the beginning to middle of an apocalypse environmentally. That's my personal view, that's why I'm prepping. So everybody flees the city, but they do it slowly. There was no single reason for people leaving. We knew that all public service had stopped to the south and to the east. And that this state of affairs was spreading our way. We knew that everyone had left those parts of the country, except for bands of people, mostly youngsters, who lived on what they could find. Crops left ungathered in the fields, animals had escaped, slaughter before everything had broken down. Animals that had escaped slaughter before everything had broken down. There would be very few of them. These bands or gangs had not, to begin with, particularly violent or harmful to the few people who had refused to leave. They even cooperated with the forces of law and order, as the newscasts put it. Then, as food became more scarce, and whatever danger was that the first set's populations on the move away from it became closer, the gangs became dangerous. And when they passed through the suburbs of our city, people ran inside and stayed out of their way. Kinda different. One of the things that's ominous in this book is that these groups of travellers leave the city. No traveller ever returns to the city, it's never understood why not. Now this is a feeling I think a lot of preppers have. I was feeling more and more that my ordinary daytime life was irrelevant. And I think that's pretty much how a lot of people might be thinking right now. Now, food scarcity does increase violence, we do know that. She introduces a wall in the room of the apartment that this woman lives in, and this wall is either a metaphor or an actual portal into a different dimension. It's not done in a fantasy crazed way, it's just unclear what's actually going on. Is she actually travelling through this wall or just imagining it? But it's kind of interesting. The wall actually drops her off a child, who then becomes a young lady, though still a child. But the whole narration is through the eyes of the woman, whose name is not actually given. So the girl's called Emily. So this I will read. But these words convey perfectly the atmosphere of what was happening when Emily was brought to me. While everything, all forms of social organisation broke up, we lived on, adjusting our lives as if nothing fundamental was happening. It was amazing how determined, how stubborn, how self-renewing were the attempts to lead an ordinary life. When nothing or very little had been left of what we'd been used to, had been taken for granted even 10 years before, we went on talking, behaving as if those old forms were still ours. And indeed, order of the old kind, food, amenities, even luxuries, did exist at the higher levels. We all knew that. Though of course those who enjoyed these things did not draw attention to themselves. Order could exist in pockets of space of time, through periods of weeks and months, or in particular districts. Inside them people would live and talk and even think as if nothing had changed. When something really bad happened, as when an area got devastated, people might move out for days or weeks or stay with relatives or friends, and then move back, perhaps to a looted house, to take up their jobs, their housekeeping, their order. We can get used to anything at all. This is commonplace, of course, but perhaps you have to live through such a time to see how horribly true it is. There is nothing that people won't try to accommodate into ordinary life. It was precisely this which gave that time its particular flavour. The combination of the bizarre, the hectic, the frightening, the threatening, an atmosphere of siege or war, with what was customary, ordinary, even decent. For instance, on the newscasts and in the papers, they would pursue for days the story of a single kidnapped child, taken from its pram perhaps by some poor unhappy woman. The police would be combing through the suburbs and countryside, hundreds looking for the child, and for the woman to punish her. But the next news flash would be about a mass death of hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people. We still believed, wanted to believe, that the concern about the single child, the need to punish the individual criminal, even if it took days and weeks, and hundreds of our hard-worked police force to do it, was what really represented us. The second about the catastrophe was, as such terms of news had always been for people who were not actually in the threatened area, an unfortunate and minor, or at least not critical accident, which interrupted the even flow of the development of civilization. Wow. So Emily's 12 when she shows up. I think this book goes over about 2 to 3 years, it's not specific. She has a little doggy with her that's like a cat. That's kind of fascinating. Is Emily there? Is the dog there? I don't know. I really don't know. At the end of the book. I don't need to know. Now when they talk about the gangs themselves, this is kind of interesting because they also talk about food. As long as travellers were with the migrating gangs, they were hooligans. But when they hived off to find shelter with some family or household, they were suddenly refugees. A household that held 5 people suddenly held 12, and the resulting frictions led to adultery and an incident where a young girl seduced a man old enough to be her grandfather, as good women indignantly described it. They managed to organise a not very well attended meeting about the decay of family life and about immorality, about sexual indulgence. This was comic, of course, unless it was sad. Unless, as I've suggested, it was admirable, a sign of the vitality of the said ordinary life, which would in the end defeat chaos, disorder and the malevolence of events. Or what can you say about the innumerable citizens' groups that came into existence right up to the end? for any ethical or social purpose you could think of, to improve old age pensions at a time when money was giving way to barter, to supply vitamin tablets to children, to provide visiting service for household invalids, to arrange formal legal adoption of abandoned children, to forbid the news of any violent or unpleasant event, so as to not put ideas into young people's heads, to reason with the gangs of hooligans as they came through the streets, or to alternatively birch them. That's beating people with sticks. It was a common form of capital punishment in England at the time. To go around and about the streets exhorting people to restore a sense of decency to their sexual practices, to agree not to eat the meat of cats and dogs, and so on and so on and so on. There really was no end to it. Farce. Spitting into a hurricane. Standing in front of a mirror to touch at one's face or straighten a tie as the house crashes around them. Extending the relaxed, accommodating hand of the royal handshake to a barbarian who will certainly bend and take a good bite out of it. Strong stuff. I see parallels in that all around us. Now, the Hugo the dog cat, I don't know, anyway, they decide to get some food for it, and she has cash here, a fair amount of cash, but we don't ever see why. She's living in modest circumstances, but we don't really know why. She's comfortable. I made up my apology and hastened out to the shops to buy whatever cat or dog foods I could find for Hugo. You see, even that, she leaves it ambiguous as to what Hugo actually is. It took some time to find a shop which still stocks such things. I was an object of interest to the shop assistant, an animal lover who applauded my intention to stand up for my right to keep pets in these days. I also interested one or two of the other customers, and I was careful not to say where I lived when one asked me, and went home by a misleading route and made sure I was not being followed. Yep. People can't get over eating meat. So Emily believes, because Emily's like a child of the time, the way she came from never really is apparent. Emily believes that there wasn't anybody who came near her, into her line of sight, who was not experienced by her as a threat. I think that's a good attitude in SHTF, to be honest, but you can see why such an attitude would be prevalent. She talks about a woman she sees, the wife of a former stockbroker who had become a junk dealer. Things are changing in this book. Society is changing. So we talk about school. Emily's 12 at the time, right? What was the point? Most schools had given up any attempt of teaching. They had become, for the poorer people at least, extensions of the army, of the apparatus for keeping the population under control. There were still schools for children of the privileged class, the administrators and the overseers. Janet White went to one of them, but I thought too much of Emily to offer to send her to one, even if I was able to get a place for her. It was not that education there was bad. It was irrelevant. Good farming folk was how safety, refuge, peace, utopia shaped itself in very many people's minds in those days. And I think that's true. I think a lot of preppers think that the idea of the homestead, the farm, the independence of such a lifestyle is very attractive to a lot of preppers, whereas the reality would be somewhat different. As society slowly decays, for buying clothes or materials in the shops where I was this time a status symbol, the shops were really only used by the administrating class, by, as most people called them, the talkers. I was out a good deal, busy on that common occupation gathering news, and for a while I had, like everyone else, a radio, while I was a member of a newspaper circle. Shortage of newspaper print made it necessary for groups of people to buy newspapers and journals in common and circulate them, and I, like everyone else, looked for news, real news. So, pre-internet, for sure, I think a lot of people are doing that today, but they're using the internet for that. And it's interesting because she says the rumour and newscast and all the rest of it. Of course it was often inaccurate, but then all news is inaccurate. So there you go, Doris lesson 1974. All news is fake news, from certain angles. So one of the things that happens is that children become more and more feral as the book goes on. It's not really that explicit and then becomes explicit. So maybe this apocalypse is genetic, maybe it's environmental, maybe there has been a war somewhere else, but it's never clear. So why rumour and all the rest of it? We had to know what gangs were approaching or rumoured to be approaching. Gangs, which as I've said, were not all kids and youngsters by now, were made of every kind and age of person, with more and more tribes, with more and more tribes with a new social unit. And I think that's true in any apocalypse. Tribal units will be the social unit. We had to know what soldiers were expected or might be abating. If another suburb decided to turn its back entirely on gas, electricity and oil, revert to candle power and ingenuity. If a new rubbish dump had been found, and if so, could ordinary people get access to its riches, where there were shops that might have hides or old blankets or rose hips for vitamin syrups, or recycled plastic objects, or metal items like sieves and saucepans, or whatever it was, whatever might be cast up from the dead time of plenty. And I think a lot of us are concerned about that. And I think a lot of us might look at that as an interesting thing to do. Shopping and governance is covered in the book quite heavily. I already mentioned about the talkers. Yet even at that late stage, there was a level of our society which managed to live as if nothing was happening, nothing irreparable. The ruling class. But that was a dead phrase, as they said very well then. The kind of person who ran things, administered, sat on council and committees, made decisions, talked. The bureaucracy, an international bureaucracy. When it has not been true that the section of society when has it not been true that the section of society which gets the most out of itself, maintains itself, and for as long as it can in others, an illusion of security, permanence and order? Yep, pretty much true. The elite make sure they're comfortable. The one thing these markets were not short of, the one commodity no one had been short of for a long time, was labour. Hands to work at whatever was needed. She talks about how private enterprise tries to work out, but the government's kind of evil about all this. Mr. Meadow had bought rights to it in a rubbish dump before the government had commandeered all rubbish dumps. And she lists useful occupations in the new age. A chair mender, a basket mender, surrounded with his twisted rushes and reeds, a knife grinder. Here they all were, the old schools, each with a guard, each watched by marvelling barbarians. And to document what's happening, they decided they need to do some stuff, so they clear out stuff they don't need any longer in their apartment. We found an old saucepan, an enamel jug, a plastic bowl, a scrubbing brush. This was what we got in exchange for the electrical equipment of what had been, after all, a lavishly equipped flat. Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day, scrubbing brushes. I think we do need to get some scrubbing brushes. I think they're a good idea. Not something we like to do. Talks a bit about government again, and I'm going to take a break after this. What they could not tolerate even now, was even the semblance of a public meeting which might threaten them. Extraordinary and pathetic, for the last thing that anyone interested by this time was changing the form of government. We wanted only to forget it. Anyway, that's part one. I think I should do part two soon, but take it easy, au revoir.